Good day, distinguished guests, panelists, and colleagues. My name is Agron Pali, and on behalf of the Global Monitoring Center, it is my honor to introduce you to this virtual conference under the theme Morocco's Occupation of Western Sahara as a Threat to Regional and International Peace and Security. The Global Monitoring Center is an independent and impartial nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing peace, justice, and human rights worldwide. Through civic engagement, advocacy, and international dialogue, we work to identify solutions that promote accountability, coexistence, and resilience in communities across the globe. Western Sahara remains Africa's last colony, and its people continue to be denied the right to self-determination as guaranteed under international law and successive UN resolutions. Today, we are gathered with leading experts to examine how Morocco's occupation undermines peace and stability, not only in the region, but also at the international level. Before we begin, let me briefly outline how today's conference will proceed. We will first hear from our distinguished panelists, Dr. Jacob Mundy, Dr. Jeffrey Smith, and Ms. Katlyn Thomas, each offering their analysis and expertise on Western Sahara. For their presentation, after the presentation, I will open the floor for a Q&A session where participants are encouraged to submit questions through this chat. And finally, we will conclude with closing remarks from Ambassador Sidi Mohamed Omar, representative of the Frente Polisario at the United Nations, before I will formally close this conference. With that, let us turn to our first panelist, Dr. Jacob Mundy, Associate Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies and Director of the Peace and Conflict Studies at Colgate University in New York. He is also a non-resident visiting fellow with the European Council on Foreign Relations and a former Fulbright Scholar in Tunisia. Dr. Mundy has researched and published extensively on issues of armed conflict and foreign intervention in Western Sahara, Algeria, Libya, and the Sahara Sahel. Among his many works is Western Sahara, War, Nationalism, and Conflict Irresolution, co-authored with Stephen Zune. Dr. Mundy, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Great. Great to be with you all. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. Is there a way for me to share my screen, or should I just sort of chat? I put together a PowerPoint, but if I don't need.
Let's get our tech over.
Oh, hold on. There it is. Okay. All right. Again, thank you for having me here. My intervention today was just going to be a kind of setting the stage for the two other.
Apologies on that, Dr. Jacob Mundy. I believe that we're having some connection issues on your end.
Oh, looks up. I'm back.
All
okay,
right.
I was dropped for a second.
Okay.
All right, so let me the broad historical sketch give about Western Sahara. It occurred to me as I was working on this, as a lot of us have realized, this November will mark the 50th anniversary of Morocco's invasion of the territory, and thus it will also mark the 50th anniversary of the displacement of upwards of 40% of the indigenous population of Western Sahara, who've been living in refugee camps in southwest Algeria since then. And you can see that illustrated on the map. So that's 50 years of occupation. The United Nations has been on the ground in Western Sahara for 34 years. And promise, and the still existing mandate of the mission in Western Sahara is to hold a referendum. That mission, so date of the to hold should be brought up. It's been 28 years. I think it should also be reminded that it's been that long since we've had in a group and between Morocco, Western Saharan independence movement, the one and only signed agreement between the parties, which was to implement the 1991 settlement plan. And that is known as the Houston Accords. Fast forwarding, it's been 6 years since the parties have met in UN-sponsored peace talks in 2019 under the late German president, Horst Kohler. The current UN envoy has been unsuccessful in convoking the parties to negotiations. And for 5 years, we've now lived in a state where the ceasefire that had held since 1991 in Western Sahara has collapsed. And so the situation has now reverted to one of open armed conflict. So just laying out some of the important historical background, again, from a perspective of the legal issues at stake here. Now, Western Sahara came under Spanish possession in 1885. The broader context was something we call the Scramble for Africa, or late Victorian imperialism, the final outburst of European imperialism across the world, but especially focused on Africa. Western Sahara was claimed by Spain separately from Spanish interests in Morocco. Eventually, Spain would join France in its quote-unquote protectorate of Morocco. Spain would have two territories, one in the north, one in the south. A couple of smaller territories, the Presidios, the Spanish Presidios in the north, which had already been Spanish for a long time, and then the territory of Sidi Ifni, a city in the south of Morocco. But those were all understood to be protectorates, and that is governed on behalf of the Moroccan monarchy by European powers. Western Sahara, is important to notice, was claimed under terra nullius, the idea of no man's land. And we will come back to this because it becomes an important concept in the international. Western Sahara was not an important colony for Spain initially. It wasn't even fully occupied until the 1930s, and that was under duress from France, who was facing guerrilla resistance from the Sahrawis in Western Sahara across the border into French Algeria at the time. And so as you can see, the progression of Sahrawi resistance that is here, the 1930s, 50s, 60s, and then 70s to the present, right? That was one of the driving forces, was that Spain was facing resistance in the 1930s. The issue of phosphates, which is legally complex and also important to the territory, is important, but that those don't materialize as an incentive for Spain until after World War II. So they weren't really discovered and cultivated until that period. But it was the potential phosphate wealth already on top of the well understood fisheries wealth. Again, Western Sahara was seized by Spain partially just because it was adjacent to the coast of the Canary Islands. And so Spain had already had a vested economic, political interests in that region of Africa. And so in 1958, Western Sahara was declared a province of Spain, an overseas province, no different than the Canary Islands from the Spanish point of view. And so that also becomes legally very interesting when we think about Morocco's aggression in 1975 was against what Spain viewed at the time as a part of its territory. Now, Morocco, upon independence in 1956, Mauritania in 1960, both claimed Western Sahara as a part of their historical territory, terra irredentia. We'll get to some of those issues as well. But it's important to recognize that by the 1960s, Western Sahara, as a Spanish colony or province from the Spanish point of view, was viewed as a non-self-governing territory by the United Nations. And as that decade progressed, the UN General Assembly began to call for self-determination in the territory and even called for its independence. And that is sometimes overlooked, that the UN General Assembly was saying that the territory should be shepherded by Spain to independence by the 1970s. Now, what is the basis of Morocco's claim to the territory, and why did they invade in 1975? Now, broadly, Morocco has, and in some ways has ambivalently not forsaken this idea that the actual size of Morocco is much larger than the territory bequeathed to it by Spain and France at the end of the colonial period. in 1956, beginning as an idea within the nationalist movement, but eventually becoming something championed by the Moroccan monarchy, was this idea of Greater Morocco, such that large parts of Western Algeria, all of Mauritania, northern Mali, Western Sahara were a part of Morocco's historical territory. This also includes the Spanish enclave of Ceuta and Melilla, which come up again and again whenever Morocco wants to instrumentalize those issues for political gain vis-a-vis Spain. But the important thing here is that within the Moroccan national identity, right, the idea that Western Sahara is a part of Morocco is a part of a larger territorial claim. And one often finds, this within Moroccan textbooks. It's in the educational system. One often finds maps in Morocco that had very ambiguous southern, western, or southern, eastern border areas, for example. And so this idea is partially what motivates Morocco on an ideological level. But why Morocco chose to invade in 1975, it's really important to understand the very acute crisis that was facing the Moroccan monarchy. On the one hand, there were two military coup attempts that we know about against King Hassan II, and those almost succeeded. Now, considering the historical trends in the Middle East, in the Arab world, no one would have been surprised if the Moroccan monarchy had been overthrown by a military coup in the 1970s. It had just happened in Libya. It had just happened in other places like Iraq. Other places, eventually we saw the overthrow of the monarchy in Iran at the end of the 1970s. There was also an attempt to overthrow the Saudi monarchy at the end of the 1970s. So the historical trends in the 1970s were not favorable to monarchism and very much in line with this idea that those kinds of regimes would be thrown out the window. And so Morocco's invasion is partially motivated by a regime that is on the back foot politically, also because of the growing social tensions, rising oil prices, creating economic trouble, things of that sort, strong socialist movement, growing Islamist movement, things of that sort. So the Moroccan monarchy needed something to discipline the population, to discipline the military, and to refocus political energies elsewhere. And so the campaign to recover, quote unquote, Western Sahara became that issue. Today, we talk a lot about the economic issues, especially the fisheries, the phosphates, but now we hear lots about agribusinesses, possibility of oil and green energy, you name it. Those issues come much later, and they were not motivating factors for the Moroccan monarchy in the 1970s. Again, it's about regime survival and a nationalist ideology that is irredentist in nature. And so those forces came together in 1974, 1975 in a very toxic way. So the critical thing to understand Western Sahara in terms of the legal issues, the big legal issues, there are obviously ongoing issues of human rights violations, things of that sort, which are very important. But when we talk about the status of the territory, why it's a occupied non-self-governing territory, we really have to look to the critical years of 1974 and 1975 for these reasons. By 1974, Spain was under a lot of internal pressure from Western Saharans themselves. The Frente Polisario had been mounting armed attacks since 1973. There was also the pressure from the General Assembly, which I mentioned earlier. So the world was basically calling for Spain to divest itself of this territory and give it independence. Again, recall that in the vast majority of decolonization situations, territories were granted independence outright. There was no effort paid to heed irredentist claims from other countries. Right. So Western Sahara, much like East Timor, is an aberration of what is normal in a decolonization situation, which is that independence is granted, and then if there's a feeling that something else needs to change, then that can happen later. It doesn't preempt independence in terms of decolonization practice. Now, Spain announces a referendum in 1974 and begins the process of creating a voters list. This will come later. Katlyn can, if you're really curious, tell you all the nitty-gritty details about trying to revive that voters list in the 1990s. But the important thing is that Morocco and Mauritania tried to prevent this from happening, realizing that Spain was probably just going to give the territory independence outright. And so they asked for arbitration from the International Court of Justice, but the General Assembly would not not go for that, but they were willing to request an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. At the same time, throughout 1975, Morocco was building up its military forces in the south, in an apparent campaign to get ready for a military invasion. So again, there is intent here that we will later describe as belligerency. Now, Spain, by 1975, especially by fall 1975, is committed to the territory's independence one way or the other. They're even working with the Frente Polisario in some way. Now, as a part of the General Assembly's engagement with this issue, not only was the question referred to the International Court of Justice, but a visiting mission was sent in 1975. And one of the key observations of that visiting mission was that the territory, among all the populations, wanted independence, above all, not to be a part of Spain, not to be, associated with Spain in any way, wanted independence. Secondly, what was really critical was that Frente Polisario received the most support of any organization that existed at the time. The other leading competitor was a pro-Spanish party of elites that had basically a comprador elite that had been bought off by Spain. So the International Court of Justice holds hearings in the summer of 1975, and its landmark ruling is, or I should say opinion, it's not a ruling, its opinion is released in mid-October 1975. Now, the takeaway that everyone always talks about is that the court says whatever Morocco's and Mauritanians' claims are, and they're mostly rejected. There's a very small caveat with Morocco, and we can get into that, but it's almost silly to pay any attention to it, because the court makes two determinations that are really important. There's nothing in Morocco's and Mauritanians' claims that would prevent the territory from becoming independent in the first place, achieving self-determination. The court is adamant about that. The court is almost critiqued for even hearing the case in the first place, because it probably would never have been talked out of supporting the territory's independence or self-determination in the first place. Secondly, and this is really important, this gets back to the concept of terra nullius, no man's land, that I mentioned earlier. The court rejects the claim that Western Sahara was terra nullius in 1885, but not because it belonged to Morocco or Mauritania, but because, and to paraphrase the opinion, the peoples of Western Sahara were organized socially, economically, politically in such a way that they could represent themselves. And so Western Sahara is determined by the ICJ in 1975 as not terra nullius because the Sahrawis are the sovereign power, right? That often gets overlooked, but that's critically important if we're going to consider other legal aspects of this case. And so the court's opinion issued mid-October 1975 is definitive in that case. Hours later, after the court's opinion is released, Morocco announces that it will invade the Spanish-administered Western Sahara, and this is called the Green March. But behind the Green March is the Moroccan military. So you have the civilian facade of 350,000 Moroccans who are being trucked down to the south of the country to march into the Spanish-administered Western Sahara, but there's the threat of war behind it, that if Spain tries to stop this march, Spain will face a Moroccan invasion. Now, the CIA had already concluded this weeks prior, and I was the one who got the documents declassified. The CIA warned Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor under the Ford administration, that Morocco is going to invade the Spanish Sahara, is going to mount an attack against our ally. I'm speaking from the U.S. point of view. A U.S. ally, Spain, right? Spain, which hosts American military bases at the time, right? And so it's very clear that there is belligerent aggressive intent on the part of the Moroccans at this point. Facing this, Spain asked the Security Council for action, right? But France and the United States want to see Morocco prevail, right? So in this case, Spain and France the U.S. and France have chosen a third world country over Spain. Now, why did they do that? Well, they're afraid that if Morocco doesn't get Western Sahara, that's the end of King Hassan, right? And that will be the last monarchy in North Africa to survive. So Spain is facing a dilemma. Do they go to war with Morocco to protect Western Sahara, or do they negotiate? Now, working against Spain was the fact that the dictator Franco went into his final coma at this point. His health collapsed, and he was out of the picture. And so there's a civil war in the Spanish cabinet, different factions vying for influence, including the monarchy in Spain. And so what happens in secret, Spain cuts a deal with Morocco, and that Spain is going to leave the territory by March 1976. So what's really important here? Well, one, something that bothers me to no end is that you read media reports, even academic analyses of the Western Sahara conflict, and you hear this narrative that there was a power vacuum and that Morocco just kind of like marched in and took Western Sahara, that, Spain just decided, oh, we're going to pull up our stakes and leave Western Sahara. And then Morocco's like, oh, hey, there's no one there anymore. Let's take it over. That's not what happened at all. There was no power vacuum. Spain was not only fully in possession of the territory, they had yet to withdraw a single administrative apparatus or military unit, right? Spain was committed to the territory's independence when Morocco began its aggressive, belligerent behavior, right? So that needs to be kept in mind as well. Whenever you see this in the media, that this sort of power vacuum narrative, which didn't happen, right? So as the outcome of this transfer of power, let's call it something very neutral, a transfer of control of Western Sahara, because it wasn't a transfer of legal title in any way, the UN made two key recognitions. One, the UN was not satisfied in 1976 that the territory had achieved self-determination despite Moroccan efforts to say, oh, these tribal elders have agreed to our occupation. No, the UN, an envoy of the Secretary General, Olaf Rydbeck, said, no, this is not self-determination. Later in 2002, we received a reaffirmation from the UN Office of Legal Counsel that administrative status, which is what Spain had in Western Sahara and which Spain still technically has, cannot be transferred. So administrative status cannot be transferred. Spain is still the de jure administering power of Western Sahara, and that's critically important. EU courts have recognized this in their opinions, right? That Morocco does not have the title of administering power, which is what you need to have to be considered the rightful sort of governor of a non-self-governing territory, if you want to say it that way, right? So if Western Sahara is a de jure Spanish colony, right, and Morocco has no legal reason to be there, the Security Council did not authorize Morocco to take over Western Sahara, right? That would be the only way in which it could be a legal occupation, right? So Western Sahara is non-self-governing, right? Remember, when Trump recognized Morocco's sovereignty over Western Sahara illegally, I might add, the response of the Secretary General was to say, we don't care. States can do whatever they want. From the UN point of view, Western Sahara is a non-self-governing territory, and until there's an act of self-determination, it will remain that way, right? So Trump, France, Spain, the UK, they can all recognize Moroccan sovereignty if they want. That's not going to change how the UN views the issue, right? So if that's the case, then Morocco's status can only be one thing, and which is an occupation, right? And that Morocco occupied the territory through aggressive behavior makes it clearly a belligerent in this case. And we need to think beyond laws governing non-self-governing territories in this case, and think about international humanitarian law as fully applicable to the case of Western Sahara. This includes the Geneva Conventions, which apply to the very large number of Moroccan settlers who have been sent to Western Sahara, some who go voluntarily, but it doesn't matter because Morocco has facilitated population transfers. And that's where the violation really rests. And so we also have to think about Western Sahara as having a right to defend itself with force if necessary. Now, there's a lot of legal debate about whether non-state actors have the right of self-determination. We often hear this with respect to the issue of Palestine. In the case of Western Sahara, it is important to remember that the ICJ determined in 1975 that Western Sahara was not no man's land in 1885 because the people were sovereign. The Sahrawis were sovereign. And so the Sahrawis have a sovereign right to defend themselves with force if necessary. And that will be the concluding of my presentation, and my colleagues will pick up from there.
Thank you, Dr. Jacob Mundy, for your insightful presentation. Your work continues to shed light on the dynamic issues of the conflict in that region. Thank you once again. Well, we had our second panelist, Dr. Jeffrey Smith, that was supposed to be coming in, but he's having some technical difficulties. I will go ahead and give the floor to our third distinguished guest, panelist. Her name is Katlyn Thomas. She is an attorney based in New York, specializing in public and private international law, with a strong emphasis on dispute resolution before international tribunals. She's a graduate of Wellesley College, Stanford Law School, and a member of the bars of New York, California, and Paris. Ms. Thomas has served with MINURSO, the UN peacekeeping mission in Western Sahara, where she oversaw legal issues. She is the author of The Stealing of the Sahara and The Emperor's Clothes, The Naked Truth About Western Sahara, as well as co-editor of Justice on Trial, Law, Politics, and Western Sahara. Her legal and academic work has been instrumental in shaping international discourse on the rights of the Sahrawi people. Thank you, Ms. Thomas. We are honored to have you with us today. Please proceed.
Thank you, Adrian. Before I go into what I was prepared to talk about, I think that in case Jeff isn't able to join us, I would like to make a few comments about the legal issues involved in the Western Sahara dispute. Jacob clearly outlined the fact that the people of Western Sahara, the Sahrawis, have the right to self-determination under international law. That has been confirmed not only in the ICJ decision of 1975, but since then in several other decisions and resolutions of the Security Council throughout the years. Now, what does that entail? Well, it entails the free choice to choose whether they want to be independent or associate with any other country, including Morocco, but not necessarily Morocco. And it doesn't include being forced into accepting some other proposal made by either Morocco or the international community and depriving them of their choice. I need to make that clear because in a moment I'm going to be talking about Morocco's autonomy proposal and it's the problems with it. But I want to make it clear that at the beginning, it is not correct under international law to try to force people of a non-self-governing territory who have the right to self-determination to choose one option or another. All right. I want to make a couple of other points because you might hear Moroccans tell you that the ICJ opinion was really in their favor. They've been saying this for years. And it is true that the ICJ opinion did say that there were some ties between Morocco and the people of the territory. But the court clearly stated that these were not the types of ties that would indicate that the people of the territory were subordinate to the Moroccan Sultan. Instead, they were trade agreements and they were agreements between equals on various subjects and not the indication of subordination by the tribes of Western Sahara. So that's important for you to know because you'll hear the Moroccans deny this vigorously. I also want to talk a little bit about what happened in 1975 because it is very clear that the United States really put its thumb on this process in favor of Morocco and did so in a very nefarious method, underhanded method, I would say. Back in 1975, the U.S. government was prohibited by Congress from sending troops into African countries to support African regimes. This did not sit well with Henry Kissinger, who convened groups of African countries called the Safari Club to be surrogates for U.S. action. And one of these members of the Safari Club was Morocco. So Henry Kissinger had a vested interest in making sure that Morocco survived and its ruler survived and that it was not overthrown. And when he got the word from the CIA that Morocco was intending to invade Western Sahara and that might lead to the overthrow of the government, he immediately set forth to make sure that didn't happen. He sent an envoy, who was Vernon Walters, the deputy director of the US CIA at the time, to persuade, I use the term lightly, Spain to withdraw from the territory and to allow Morocco and Mauritania to take it over. And this was obviously successful because when the king convened thousands of Moroccan civilians at the border of Western Sahara to go in several miles to claim the territory, Spain did nothing about it. It just stood by and watched. And later on, Spain entered into agreements with Morocco and Mauritania called the Madrid Accords, under which Spain agreed formally to retire from the country and to allow Morocco and Mauritania to take it over. Now, this didn't sit well with members of the Security Council and General Assembly. However, once again, Henry Kissinger, through his envoys, made it difficult for the Security Council or the General Assembly to pass resolutions condemning the Moroccan invasion of Western Sahara. Instead, they passed a resolution acknowledging and giving praise for the Madrid Accords, under which Spain agreed to withdraw from the territory. So, and ever since that time, as I will talk about later, the United States has placed its thumb on the scales of this issue. Throughout the entire period of the war, the 16-year war between the Polisario and Morocco and Mauritania, the United States gave weapons and intelligence and other help to Morocco to try to stem Polisario advances. Despite the massive aid given to Morocco by both the United States and France and later Israel, the Polisario, this group of what used to be nomadic herders, managed to not only hold off Morocco, but actually were on the point of practically overturning the Moroccan military back in 1991, when Morocco, because its coffers had been totally depleted by that time, decided to agree to a UN-sponsored referendum to allow the people of the territory to choose whether to be independent or part of Morocco. Now, this is where I entered the picture. I was the legal officer at MINURSO, who was in charge of legal affairs and organizing this referendum, at least training the members of MINURSO who were interviewing the potential applicants and coming up with the voters list. So I know intimately about what happened during that process. And Morocco tried everything in the world to pad the voters list. I won't go into precisely what it tried to do, but take my word for it. They tried a lot. And there were at least 100,000 bogus Moroccan applicants that were put forth by Morocco who didn't meet the criteria set forth by Morocco and the Polisario for eligibility. And they expected that MINURSO, who had been rather compliant, at least the leaders had been rather compliant with Morocco during this period, they expected that they would just give in and approve these applicants. They were rudely awakened when it turned out that the commission members, who I have to give great credit for because they really took a courageous stand doing this, and many of them lost their jobs because of it, they decided not to approve the bogus applicants. And the list that was finally published by MINURSO was considered relatively fair. So when the Moroccans saw that they didn't get their way with padding the voters list, and that the people who are on the voters list would probably vote for independence, they simply pulled out of the process. And instead of forcing them to abide by their agreement, the United States and other members of the Security Council just came up with the idea that, oh, maybe we should have a negotiated settlement of this issue nowadays instead of a referendum. And this is where the situation has been now for almost 25 years. The UN has been trying to force the parties into a negotiated settlement of the issue, which cannot happen because the parties' opinions are just too widely divergent. Morocco says it won't accept anything except autonomy or integration into Morocco, and won't accept anything that might allow the Polisario to potentially have an independent state. And the Polisario, for their part, says we won't accept anything that doesn't allow us to have the option of independence. This is where it stood now for 25 years, and it's not going to get any different in the future. All right. So I've given you a brief explanation of a few things that I was going to talk about in the question and answer period when we got to it. So now I'll talk about what I plan to talk about, which is the Moroccan autonomy proposal versus Sahrawi independence. You will hear a number of diplomats and so-called experts who claim that Morocco's autonomy proposal is the optimal solution to the Western Sahara conflict. In my opinion, this is just a cop-out, an easy way to avoid the fact that under international law, the Sahrawis have the right to self-determination, and that self-determination does not mean being forced to accept annexation into Morocco, regardless of the terms. But if any of these diplomats and others really examine the provisions of the autonomy proposal, they would soon also find that it falls far short of delivering an optimum solution to the problem. Let us look at its provisions. Yes, on paper, the people of Western Sahara would have some control over local government. However, Morocco would retain exclusive jurisdiction over the constitution and religious prerogatives of the king, national security and defense of territorial integrity, and the kingdom's juridical order. The supreme and constitutional courts would be the highest judicial authorities. I should note at the outset that the proposal fails to discuss the status of the thousands of Moroccan settlers brought into the territory, contrary to the provisions of Article 49 of the Geneva Treaty, who today outnumber native Sahrawis by 3-1. If they are allowed to remain in the territory, they will remain in control of local institutions. Also, nothing is said about ownership of the resources of the territory. Today, the king and a number of his generals own most of the agricultural land and fishing resources of the territory. The Boukra mine is a subsidiary of OCP, the Moroccan phosphate industry, and a number of foreign interests have contracted with the Moroccan government for investments in the territory. If they are allowed to retain their interests, they will continue to have a stranglehold over the local population and the economy of the territory. The Moroccan government would be in charge of national security and the defense of territorial integrity. Today, under the guise of protecting national security and territorial integrity, Morocco has turned the territory into a virtual police state. Presumably then, the secret police and army would remain in the territory, keeping the population in line. And the king is the head of the army. These are serious defects, but the most glaring problem of the autonomy proposal is that the people would be subject to the Moroccan constitution and judicial system. And let's examine the power of the king under the Moroccan constitution. In 2012, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance published a study entitled The 2011 Moroccan Constitution, a Critical Analysis. It noted that Articles 23, 24, 27, and 30, which permit the king to appoint the prime minister and other cabinet members, terminate them at will, dissolve parliament at will, and rule by decree, and head the army, together grant the king unlimited power over the institutions of the country. And if these powers are not enough, Article 19, which designates the king the defender of the faithful, allows him, by the use of dahirs, or royal religious decrees, to override the terms of the Constitution and any provision of the law at will, including the provisions of any autonomy agreement. The autonomy proposal specifically provides that the people of the autonomous region would be subject to the religious prerogatives of the king. As far as the judicial system is concerned, as noted previously, the Supreme Court and Constitutional Court would be the highest judicial authorities able to overrule any decision of courts in the autonomous region. And the king is head of the Constitutional Court, which rules on any issue involving the Constitution, and he appoints half its members. And so we see that even on paper, the so-called autonomy proposal would fall far short of offering the Sahrawis true autonomy. Instead, it amounts to an elaborate subterfuge to maintain what in all essential aspects is the status quo. In fact, Morocco cannot offer the Sahrawis true autonomy. It can't afford to. Morocco is an authoritarian state ruled by one of the last of the absolute monarchs. If the present system of government in the Polisario camps is any guide, the Sahrawis would wish to establish an essentially democratic system of government, with laws that would accord women and minorities equal rights, which would fight corruption, and which would respect judicial fairness, freedom of speech and religion, and other human rights, all of which are virtually non-existent in present-day Morocco. This has been corroborated by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. Indeed, Freedom House assigns Morocco a freedom score of only 37 out of 100. These observations have been to some extent corroborated by the U.S. State Department in various country reports. And these are the reports of conditions in Morocco proper. In Western Sahara, the conditions are much worse. Is it realistic to believe that the king would permit the type of laws that exist in the Polisario camps to exist within his kingdom, with the implication for unrest among other population groups? There is already grumbling among groups in the Atlas regions about perks given to Moroccan settlers in Western Sahara. Creating an autonomous region within a state is difficult, under even the most propitious circumstances. But the record of autonomous regions carved out of authoritarian states like Morocco is not promising. As my colleague, Professor Mundy, has noted in his book, Western Sahara War, Nationalism, and Conflict Irresolution, in 1952, the British Protectorate of Eritrea was accorded autonomous status within Ethiopia by the United Nations. In 1961, however, the Ethiopian emperor unilaterally revoked this status, annexing Eritrea, resulting in 30 years of conflict. Likewise, the Serbian leader Milosevic decided to revoke the autonomous status of Kosovo in 1989, precipitating a conflict that was only ended years later after NATO intervention. And when Great Britain ceded control of Hong Kong, the Chinese government promised that its people would have self-rule. How has that turned out? Is it realistic to believe that despite its record of breaking every promise to the Sahrawis and the international community since this conflict began, Morocco would actually keep the promises contained in an autonomy agreement? Let us look at the record. In 1974, Morocco persuaded the international community to postpone a referendum that would have permitted the Sahrawis to establish an independent nation in order to pursue its sovereignty claims before the International Court of Justice. But when the court rejected its claim, it forced Spain to withdraw and invaded the territory anyway. In 1991, in order to end a 16-year war which had drained its coffers, Morocco agreed to permit the UN to conduct a referendum under which the Sahrawis might choose independence. Yet when the UN's list of eligible voters was not to its liking, it simply withdrew from the process. In 2002, the UN Legal Counsel, Hans Corell, stated that absent the content of the Sahrawis, it would be illegal for Morocco to use the resources of the territory. Yet today, Morocco continues to use the resources of the territory with impunity. And now, contrary to its position at the UN and international law, it has attempted to simply annex outright the territory. And who would intervene to support the Sahrawis' rights if Morocco broke its promises? The UN? The United States? The African Union? Really? Now let us look what would happen if Western Sahara got its independence. As already noted, the government of the Arab Democratic Republic, the state created by the Polisario, which currently represents the indigenous people of Western Sahara, the Sahrawis, both in the camps and in the occupied territories, and is the party representing that group before the United Nations. It is secular, essentially democratic, and Western in its values. Rather than religious extremists, the Sahrawis have historically followed a moderate form of Islam, and this is reflected in their present government and in the government's association with outside groups. Their constitution is based on the Constitution of the United States, with a Bill of Rights that permits religious freedom, Article 44, affords individuals due process, Article 27, the presumption of innocence, Article 27, the right to privacy and the sanctity of the home, Article 28, freedom of speech and expression, Article 30, freedom of association, Article 31, freedom from unlawful detention and the right to counsel, Article 27, freedom to hold private property, Article 35, and the right to vote and hold office, Article 33. And the laws permit women the freedom to marry and divorce at will, and have property, inheritance, and child custody rights equal to men, unlike those granted to the women in Morocco through the often acclaimed Mudawana. A number of Christian religious groups have set up offices in the camps. Political debate among the people in the camps is widespread. Indeed, the privately owned radio station has often criticized the government policy. The political setup in the camps permits individual participation at every level of government. The population is assigned to 4 separate subunits called wilayas. The grassroots level of decision-making and management is entrusted to the hayya, each one comprising about 200 families. 4 hayyas form a district called a daira. On a yearly basis, the 6 or 7 daira within a wilaya would hold a base congress to assign a director and establish committees that would supervise the overall management of the wilaya. Strategic decisions concerning domestic and foreign policy issues are made at general congresses, held intermittently when important issues arise. In 1991, a popular elected National Secretariat was created to replace an executive committee which had comprised the veteran Polisario leaders, and the Congress adopted a platform calling explicitly for multi-party democracy and a free market economy following independence. More recently, 50 or more individuals chosen by Sahrawi organizations in Western Sahara were also appointed as delegates to the Congress, able to vote on the leadership and other political matters. And there are important political organizations within the camps that have major impact on government policy. One of the groups is a labor union that presses the concern of laborers in the camps. Another is a women's union that has been active in promoting the rights of women and their education. As a result of activities of women in the camps, a special school, the September 29 school, was established specifically to educate adult women who had been denied education under Spanish rule. Because of their efforts, the camps have attained a 95% literacy rate, something that James Baker called extraordinary in the Arab and Muslim world, and far higher than Morocco has been able to achieve. I believe you can draw your own comparison between the prospective life of the Sahrawis under the Moroccan autonomy proposal and the type of laws and society they wish to create if Western Sahara is granted independence. One more thought. Throughout its existence, Morocco has attempted to paint a black picture of the Polisario, first claiming that they were communists, and more recently that they were terrorists aligned with radical Islamic groups and countries such as Iran and Syria. And now Congressman Joe Wilson has attempted to pass a resolution in Congress declaring the Polisario a terrorist group. There is no evidence to support these claims. According to Al Jazeera, Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif has categorically denied an affiliation, including charges that the Iran government was training Polisario fighters. And there is no independently verifiable evidence to support the claim that Iranian-trained Polisario forces are being kept prisoners in Syria. Also, although the Polisario have managed to acquire weapons that enable them to shoot down unmanned drones entering their territory, There is no evidence that the origin of these weapons is Iran. As far as breaking the ceasefire established in 1991 is concerned, the Polisario have every right to do so. The ceasefire was part of a deal by which Morocco agreed to abide by a UN-conducted referendum for the people of the territory. Now that Morocco has refused to allow a referendum to take place, the ceasefire agreement has been voided by Morocco's own actions. There is simply no evidence that the Polisario are targeting civilians in their conflict with Morocco or any other activities that would suggest terrorism. Rather, the Polisario have made every attempt to settle this conflict by diplomatic means, and the Sahrawis, under their leadership, deserve a chance to create an independent state in Western Sahara. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Thomas, for your valuable presentation and insight. Unfortunately, Dr. Jeffrey Smith is experiencing some technical difficulties and will not be able to join us at this time. But no worries, we will be honored to have Dr. Smith with us in the future. With that, we will move directly into our Q&A segment. I invite all participants to submit their questions in the chat, and I will direct them to our panelists. While we wait for another question to come in, I'd like to pose one myself, actually, and it's to both Dr. Mundy and also Katlyn Thomas. All right, so the first question is, many policymakers have condemned territorial annexation in Ukraine, but accepts Morocco's in Western Sahara. What does this double standard mean for the credibility of international law, and how can it be challenged?
I guess I'll go first. I mean, this is something we've been pointing out, those of us who followed this issue, various attempts by the international community to enforce the norms against aggression, and yet we point out, well, there's also Western Sahara. I think, the Sahrawis, the refugees themselves, put it really in the best framing one could think of, is that when James Baker was the first personal envoy of the Secretary General of the United Nations for Western Sahara, he made a visit to the refugee camps, and the Sahrawis there created a sign that said very simply, in regards to the 1991 Gulf War, Kuwait yes, Western Sahara no, why? And I think that was just like, succinct and beautiful. And so this has come up a lot. And so, yes, it's very difficult in the face of all of this rhetoric about Ukraine, international norms, aggression, yada, yada. And yet, Morocco just is, in its occupation of Western Sahara, is just off the radar. And yet the issues are very much the same. Now, what to do about it, right? Well, I think there is a part of the world that still cares about international law, norms, things of that sort. The post-World War II system is just, the problem is that the architects, the North Atlantic powers, the architects of the post-World War II order don't seem to really care about the order that they created, right? So I think leadership is going to come from elsewhere in this world. And, sad to say that, now that France, the United States, and the UK is on the verge of all recognizing Morocco's illegal annexation of Western Sahara, who does that leave as the last credible permanent 5 member of the Security Council on the issue of Western Sahara? It's China. And that's where global leadership is coming from these days.
We'll just add a couple of comments. You're absolutely right. It's a double standard. And there's no getting around that. And we see throughout the world today and throughout the world historically that there have been these double standards constantly. I think one of the problems that the Sahrawis face is that there are very few of them, and there are very few of them who live in countries that are the most powerful in the world, including the United States. So they don't have a lot of power behind their legal status. And And it's difficult for countries to uphold the rights of people who are in this kind of a weak position when it comes to bucking people who are not in a weak position. The United States, I think I mentioned this earlier, has pursued a two-faced policy towards this issue for a long, long time, ever since the conflict began. Um, Unfortunately, the United States has not lived up to the lofty principles that um, it so often espouses about international law and the rule of law and fighting aggression and all of these kinds of things when put into practice. Today, with the present administration, I doubt very much that they care at all. Um, I just hope that someday the United States will go back on at least the course of trying to live up to some of these principles. And perhaps if we publicize more what has happened in the past and what the rights of the people are, perhaps that this will get more traction and things will start to improve in the future. But for right now, I don't hold out very much hope for it.
Thank you, Katlyn Thomas. I do have another question that I wanted to ask. It's actually from us. Based on your legal expertise, how should the US and other democracies respond to efforts like HR 4119 that attempts to delegitimize the Polisario Front and also the Sahrawi struggle as well?
Are you asking me? All right.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I think you're referring to the bill that was proposed by Joe Wilson that would
Correct.
name the Polisario as terrorists. Um, well, the only way we can fight against something like that is to broadcast the truth. And I think that a lot of people in Congress actually know that this is not the case. Um, Certainly, the people in the State Department know. And the people in the Pentagon, I'm sure, they also know. Um, so those of us who care about this issue just have to publicize it as much as possible and point out the flaws in their arguments. I tried to do that today with some of their arguments. Wasn't able to talk about all of them. But if people broadcast to their friends, neighbors, congressmen, etc., that these accusations are false, then maybe that we will see a positive outcome for this issue.
Very well said, Ms. Thomas. I would actually like to bring one question over for Dr. Jacob Mundy. In your book with Stephen Zune, you describe Western Sahara as a case of conflict irresolution. Looking at the ceasefire collapse at 2020, what do you see as the greatest risks of wider instability in the Maghreb and Sahel region? If the question remains unsolved, what will happen, let's say, in the next 10 to 15 years between the two?
I mean, the title of the book, it was published in a book series about conflict resolution, so we were sort of poking fun at the people who were publishing our book. But yeah, that cheeky subtitle got at a very important point, which is that immediately after Western Sahara is invaded by Morocco in 1975, the Organization of African Unity, the predecessor of the African Union, gets involved and tries to resolve the conflict. And the template that they come up with is exactly what the UN adopts in the late 1980s, which is a ceasefire, return of the refugees, and a referendum, independence, integration, right? Western Sahara, actually, the first thing we have to recognize is consenting to a referendum that could lead to annexation by Morocco is itself a huge compromise, right? That they don't have to engage with that. Like they don't have to even have that on the ballot, right? Again, as I mentioned, decolonization practice for the vast majority of the billion people that experienced it in the 20th century was just outright independence, right? And so that itself was a huge compromise. And to say like, well, we will leave it up to the people, and they will get to vote, and they can choose Morocco, they can choose independence, and that's the way it is. Baker tried to finesse that in 2003 by saying, well, why don't we try autonomy for 5 years, see how it goes, and then have a referendum with independence, autonomy, or integration with Morocco. And the really telling fact was not only that Morocco rejected the yes/no referendum that Katlyn was talking about in 2000 when Mohammed VI came to power. In 2003, Morocco rejected a referendum that demographically it should have won because it included Moroccan settlers in the electorate, so that it was at least evenly balanced, if not skewed, towards Moroccan settlers, people who are not Sahrawi or Western Saharan by blood in any way, right? So Morocco rejected a referendum that it should have on paper won, which tells you maybe something about how Morocco thinks its own population feels about Western Sahara and the Moroccan government, right? Also, how they probably think most Western Saharans feel about being occupied and annexed by Morocco. Now, what's the problem with this issue? Well, it's the problem of just sheer complacency on the part of the North Atlantic powers, that they view situations like Western Sahara as stable in the fact that they're unstable, right? That, and again, not to get too technical, but right, we've seen a pattern of geopolitical assertions of power throughout the post-Cold War II period, especially by the United States, where there's an effort to achieve regional balance by pitting adversaries against each other, right? One of the virtues that Henry Kissinger spoke to about Morocco's successful conquest of Western Sahara in 1975 was that it restored balance between Morocco and Algeria, Algeria being viewed as antagonistic to North Atlantic interests as it is today, whereas Morocco is quite, as Katlyn mentioned, with the Safari Club and other initiatives, Morocco was amenable. Morocco was a tool of North Atlantic interests as it is today, right? And so the North Atlantic powers really actually like a small degree of manageable instability as a way of maintaining an overall architecture of control across the Middle East. This is the exact same reason why when Libya invaded Chad in the 1970s, tons of French and US aid went to support Chadian rebels. I mean, they literally called it a Libyan Contra, right? That they were going to raise a Contra against Libya, right? And so these kinds of like stability through instability, right? We've seen it across the Middle East. The problem is sometimes it collapses. And we saw devastatingly how everyone thought on October 6, 2023, that the Palestine issue was effectively resolved through permanent apartheid, right? And on October 7th, they got a wake-up call that this stability through instability that they had predicated their power on was not stable, and it collapsed in a dramatic fashion that has led to one of the most horrific humanitarian crises we've ever seen, right? In the first case of clear outright genocide of the 21st century, right? And so who's to say that what's happening in Western Sahara, and again, the Sahara Sahel region, North Africa, right? Trying to achieve geopolitical control through patterns of variegated instability is not a way, right, to achieve long-term success, right? And I don't think the system's working anymore, right? They're trying it in Ukraine, it's not working, right? It didn't work for Israel and the Palestine, right? So yeah, I don't think that this policy is going to work in the long run. And I think if these powers, if the North Atlantic powers were self-interested, right, they would take a serious look at the Western Sahara issue. The problem is that their sense of their self-interest is very much diluted by other factors.
Thank you, Dr. Mundy. That was very insightful.
Can I add something to
Yeah,
that? I
absolutely.
just want to add the fact that James Baker believed that an independent Western Sahara would add to the stability of the region. He said, though, very forcefully. And a number of other people who are experts have said similar things. That here we're talking about a people who want to establish an essentially democratic, Western-leaning, pro-Western government among the Arab Muslim states is something that the United States says has been trying to get done for ages, ages. Here they want to do it. And the United States and others have been standing in their way. I think that a lot of people believe that if there were such a country in that part of the world, it would add to the stability of the region, not detract from it.
Thank you, Ms. Thomas. That was very insightful as well. Um, as we come to the end of this important discussion, it is my great honor to invite Ambassador Sidi Mohamed Omar, the Frente Polisario representative at the United Nations, to close today's conference with his remarks. Ambassador Omar has been a tireless advocate for the Sahrawi people's right to self-determination and continues to provide leadership and guidance in advancing this cause at an international level. Ambassador Omar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Agron, and many thanks to the Global Monitoring Center for hosting this very important event. As the two great panelists have highlighted, we're talking about 50 years Moroccan illegal occupation of Western Sahara. And so it's really timely that we engage in looking into the consequences of these continued illegal occupation. So I'll be brief, just some of the takeaways from the two panelists, to whom we express our many thanks for their insightful inputs. And although we regret that Jeffrey Smith couldn't be with us, and I hope that we will count on his presence in the future. Professor Jacob Mundy gave us a historical background to the conflict, focusing on the key moments in the history, starting from the Spanish colonial adventure into Western Sahara, but mainly focusing on the root causes of this conflict. I think among the elements that he has highlighted stands out the Moroccan expansionism, the ideology of the so-called Greater Morocco that, as he eloquently explained, encompasses in its expansion of the vision, only Western Sahara, but Mauritania and other parts of the neighboring countries. And the fact that despite all of this, Western Sahara remains an international issue on the UN agenda as a decolonization issue, with the international status of the territory recognized as a non-self-governing territory. And I think he has already made it in his writings. But the point highlighted in that sovereignty over Western Sahara resides in the Sahrawi people. That was one of the main conclusions of the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. And in this sense, when you hear so-called experts and media pundits describing Western Sahara as a disputed territory, you know that they have got it wrong. Western Sahara is not a disputed territory in terms of sovereignty. Sovereignty resides in the Sahrawi people. So the international status already established. What remains is the political status, and that's already regulated by the UN relevant resolutions 1514, 1541, 26, 25, in the sense that our people have a right to freely determine the political status of the territory and pursue their economic and so on and so forth. So what remains to be done, knowing that the sovereignty resides in the Sahrawi people, is to ask the Sahrawi people what do they want to do with their sovereignty, whether they want to exercise it within the political arrangement of their choice. And Katlyn has eloquently also talked about the Sahrawi Republic and the structures, the administrative and political structure of Frente Polisario, or whether they want to voluntarily grant it to someone else, being integrated in Morocco, for example. And this is actually what the United Nations has always been trying to do. The settlement plan is based on this, retaining sovereignty in the form of national independence or integration into the occupying state. So that's some of the elements that I said briefly that we take away from Professor Jacob Mundy. Katlyn Thomas was expert in the issue as well, gave us part of the historical background, but focus was made on the Moroccan expansionist proposal. It cannot be described otherwise. And I will not get into details, but what I would say is that she has emphasized and stressed the fact, well-known fact, undisputed, that this expansionist proposal should be taken for the way it is. It is simply a travesty, a mockery, all that self-determination stands for. And it's actually surprising, but not to understand from the perspective of international law, humanitarian national law, how some countries, renowned for their firm stand on international issue, international law, would describe this travesty as serious and credible. There's nothing credible or serious in a proposal of which main aim is to deny the people of a non-self-governing territory their inalienable right to self-determination and independence, and legitimize a lawful use of force, contrary to the letter and spirit of the UN Charter. So with this, I will finish just by thanking again the Global Monitoring Center for hosting this very important event and for inviting those who, at least, who have made it experts of the issue, and to leave you with a message of hope from the Sahrawi people. Indeed, it will be 50 years of occupation, of human rights abuses, of trying to crush and exterminate our people physically, politically, culturally, and undermine our right to exist. But we do exist, and we will always exist, because we have firm faith in ourselves, in our rights, and faith also in international law and norms, because that's the only guarantee that we have. And it's the guarantee for all people, small and big. It is the guarantee, as someone has already said, from plunging back into that kind of world in which the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. So we will resist diplomatically by all means, and we're fully open to engage with our northern neighbors to find a peaceful solution to this long-standing issue. But our northern neighbors or anybody else should make no mistake. Indeed, a small people, but a big and great people in terms of determination and in terms of our quest for peace and justice. So thank you very much again, and all the best.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Omar. That speech was very powerful and very true. And I would also like to say, on behalf of the Global Monitoring Center, I would like to sincerely thank our panelists, Dr. Jacob Mundy, Ms. Katlyn Thomas, and even Jeffrey Smith, even though he wasn't here with us today, but hopefully in the future very soon, for their valuable contributions and expertise. Your insights have helped shed light on how the occupation of Western Sahara remains a pressing issue that demands urgent international attention. This discussion reinforces the principle that the right to self-determination is not negotiable, and that peace and justice are inseparable. I would like to also thank, again, Ambassador Sidi Mohamed Omar for closing this conference with his remarks, as well as all the participants and attendees for being with us today. The struggle of the Sahrawi people is a struggle for dignity, justice, and international law. We encourage you to continue to engage, advocate, and raise awareness until a just and lasting solution is achieved. Thank you all once again, and this officially concludes our conference.